Ki Jai, Janiti Lila Parvishno Vishnupad Paramahansa Parvachakacharya Sajara Sati Shri Shrimad, His Divine Grace Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Goswami Maharaj Prabhupada Ki Jai, Ananti Koti Vaishnava Vrindi Ki Jai, Namacharya Haridas Thakur Ki Jai, Paramchiko Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Sivasari Gaura Bhakta Vrindi Ki Jai, Shri Shri Radha Krishna Gopa Govana Shyama Kunda Radha Kunda Giri Govardhana Ki Jai, Shri Vrindavan Mathura Dham Ki Jai, Shri Navadi Mayapur Dham Ki Jai, Shri Jagannath Puri Dham Ki Jai, Gangamai Jumunamai Ki Jai, Tulsi Maharani Ki Jai, Bhakti Devi Ki Jai, Samaveda Bhakta Vrindi Ki Jai, Shri Harinam Sankirtan Ki Jai, O Premanande, all glorious the assembled devotees, all glorious the assembled devotees, all glorious the assembled devotees, all glorious to Sri Guru and Sri Gauranga, glorious to Srila Prabhupada. Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasaya Budale Shri Mate Bhaktivedanta Swamini Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharane Nirvishesha Sunyavadi Pastyachada Satarane. Okay. So we are reading from Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita in the chapter entitled Developing Mayapur. So I'm going to go back just a paragraph to give a little context to what we're reading. Verse after verse in the 7th chapter confirmed the essential principles of Srila Prabhupada's mission and attested that he was teaching exactly after the method advised by Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. The characteristics, this is the quote, the characteristics of Krishna are understood to be a storehouse of transcendental love. Although that storehouse of love certainly came with Krishna when he was present, it was sealed. But when Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu came with his other associates, the Panchatattva, they broke the seal and plundered the storehouse to taste transcendental love of Krishna. The more they tasted it, the more their thirst grew. Sri Panchatattva themselves danced again and again, and thus made it easier to drink nectarian love of Godhead. They danced, cried, laughed, and chanted like madmen, and in this way they distributed love of Godhead. In commenting on these verses, Srila Prabhupada wrote, "The present Krishna consciousness movement follows the same principle, and therefore simply by chanting and dancing, we have received good responses all over the world. It is to be understood, however, that this chanting and dancing do not belong to this material world. They are actually transcendental activities, for the more one engages in chanting and dancing, the more he can taste the nectar of transcendental love of Godhead." By the phrase Krishna consciousness movement, Prabhupada spoke not only of his own disciples and his Krishna consciousness society, but also of the movement inaugurated by Lord Chaitanya. Just as the original personality of Godhead and the deity of Krishna in the temple were the same, so the movement of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and Prabhupada's Krishna consciousness movement were identical. Quote, "In distributing love of God, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and his associates did not consider who was a fit candidate and who was not, nor were such distribution or where such distribution should or should not take place. They made no conditions. Wherever they got the opportunity, the members of the Panchatattva distributed love of Godhead." This is a very important point, that this Krishna consciousness movement established by Srila Prabhupada in New York in 1965 is non-different from the movement inaugurated by Lord Chaitanya. So we are part of a great international, intergalactic, universal movement established by the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And this movement has many branches, and every branch carries the potency of the root of the tree. So this is why the scriptures, Srila Prabhupada often would repeat, that if we want to give water to a tree, forget about the branches and the flowers. I mean, not that they're not important, but just focus on the root. And we focus on that root by chanting Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. So Srila Prabhupada's movement is Lord Chaitanya's movement, is Krishna's movement, and is coming down in our particular branch from Lord Brahma. And therefore, this particular branch has a particular characteristic. It carries with it the mood of Lord Brahma. And then that mood is flavored by Madhvacharya. And that mood is then flavored further by Lord Chaitanya. And all of the acharyas who are contributing and establishing their own movements. A movement means a branch. We are a movement established by Srila Prabhupada, so Srila Prabhupada created a new branch from the tree of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, which is distributing love of Godhead freely without condition. So therefore, this movement of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness specifically, the emphasis in this movement is the mood of Srila Prabhupada. And this mood of Srila Prabhupada will permeate this movement for 10,000 years and beyond. But it will be fully manifest, and more and more and more fully manifest during the course of time as we enter further and further into the golden age created by Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and brought on behalf of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu by Srila Prabhupada to distribute all throughout the world. For Srila Prabhupada, this verse directly confirmed the instruction he had received from his spiritual master, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, that people of all births should become Vaishnavas, Brahmanas, and Sannyasis. Here was direct evidence from the scripture. Yet Prabhupada, like his own spiritual master, had often received criticism from the caste-conscious Brahmanas of India. With the proof in hand, Prabhupada now challenged his envious critics. Quote, "There are some rascals who dare to speak against the mission of Lord Chaitanya by criticizing the Krishna consciousness movement for accepting Europeans and Americans as Brahmanas and offering them sannyas. But here is an authoritative statement that in distributing love of Godhead, one should not consider whether the recipients are Europeans, Americans, Hindus, Muslims, etc. The Krishna consciousness movement should be spread wherever possible, and one should accept those who thus become Vaishnavas as being greater even than Brahmanas, Hindus, or Indians. And Chaitanya Mahaprabhu desired that his name be spread in each and every town and village on the surface of the globe. Therefore, when the cult of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is spread all over the world, should those who embrace it not be accepted as Vaishnavas, Brahmanas, and Sannyasis? These foolish arguments are sometimes raised by envious rascals. But Krishna conscious devotees do not care about them. We strictly follow the principles set down by the Pancha Tattva. So nobody wants to be criticized. Everyone wants to be accepted, respected, admired, loved. But it's not going to happen that way. This is an age of quarrel, hypocrisy, and envy, deeply embedded in the hearts of the conditioned souls. And when people see that there's some deviation from their specific perspective of the purpose of life, of the traditions of their culture, the traditions of their country, of their religion, or whatever, when something threatens that, if they feel some threat, then they will react and respond like an envious snake, and they will attack. So devotees in Krishna consciousness need to be always aware of this fact, that we will be attacked by envious snakes. That's part of life. But that will not be deterred, because we have the example in front of us of the most stalwart warrior of all time, Srila Prabhupada, who was undeterred, who entered into the depths of Kali's belly, Lower East Side, New York, in the midst of the cesspool of sinful activities. And yet Srila Prabhupada was undeterred, because he had the shelter of the instructions of his spiritual master. He had the shelter of the wish and the desires of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. He had the shelter of Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita. He had the shelter of all the previous acharyas. Srila Prabhupada, because he was and is a pure devotee, truly pure devotee, therefore he had no fear. And his life is the example for us to follow. A life of 100% devotional service, and a life free from fear and undeterred by any amount of criticism. Another criticism Srila Prabhupada encountered was that his emphasis on proselytizing was actually alien to Indian spirituality. Even Prabhupada's godbrothers had occasionally made such remarks. More often, however, this sentiment came from the impersonalists, who argued that people should be left to conceive of religion in their own ways. Religion, being an eternal spiritual affair, should not be propagated by zealous evangelism. Preaching and conversion, they said, were for the Christians, not for the followers of Indian religion. In the 7th chapter of Chaitanya Charitamrita Adi Leela, however, Sri Krishna Chaitanya, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, reveals his heart and emotion as the ideal preacher. Quote, "Although the members of the Panchatattva plundered the storehouse of love of Godhead and ate and distributed the contents, there was no scarcity, for this wonderful storehouse is so complete that as the love is distributed, the supply increases hundreds of times." So there's this statement that if you have knowledge and don't give it, you'll lose it. But if you have knowledge and give it, it will increase. So this is the same principle. If you have love of Krishna and you hoard it for yourself, eventually it will wither away. But if you have love for Krishna and distribute it to others, it will expand unlimitedly. This is the mood of Lord Chaitanya. This is the mood of Srila Prabhupada and the mood of our Krishna consciousness movement. The flood of love of Godhead swelled in all directions, and thus young men, old men, women, and children were all immersed in that inundation. Shri Shri Radha Rastabi Hari Ki Jai, Shri Shri Gaurnitai Ki Jai, Sita Ram Lakshmana Hanuman Ki Jai. The Krishna consciousness movement will inundate the entire world and drown everyone, whether one be a gentleman, a rogue, or even a lame, invalid, or blind. This is an absolute statement. So let's listen to this again. The Krishna consciousness movement will inundate the entire world and drown everyone, whether one be a gentleman, a rogue, or even lame, invalid, or blind. When the first 5 members of the Panchatattva saw the entire world drowned in love of Godhead and the seed of material enjoyment in the living entities completely destroyed, they all became exceedingly happy. The more the 5 members of the Panchatattva caused the rains of love of Godhead to fall, the more the inundation increased and spread all over the world. This was Srila Prabhupada's spirit in training young men and women in the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. And he was offering these words of Lord Chaitanya to strengthen all of the Lord's devotees. The members of the Krishna Consciousness movement should be confident that by preaching purely, they would meet with success. Prabhupada was confident. Here were the words of Shastra, words spoken by the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and Prabhupada's personal experience confirmed the same. Thus, he could write, quote, "Our Krishna consciousness movement was started single-handedly, and no one provided for our livelihood. But at present, we are spending hundreds and thousands of dollars all over the world, and the movement is increasing more and more. Although jealous persons may be envious, if we stick to our principles and follow the footsteps of Panchatattva, this movement will go on unchecked by imitation swamis, sannyasis, religionists, philosophers, or scientists, for it is transcendental to all material considerations. Therefore, those who propagate the Krishna consciousness movement should not be afraid of such rascals and fools." So, I was once on the morning walk with Srila Prabhupada, and there were maybe 10 devotees, and Dr. Patel was present, and in his usual fashion he was debating with Srila Prabhupada, arguing, but he had great love for Prabhupada. He had great respect for Prabhupada. There were times when devotees, I think Maharaj mentioned something about this. Oh, yes. So, but on this particular occasion, we had just returned from the beach, approaching the temple on the Gandhigram Road. And Srila Prabhupada was referring to these various impersonalist swamis, especially those who were extremely prominent in Bengal, and was describing how they had destroyed the Vaishnav culture of Bengal, and they were rascals and fools. And this Dr. Patel, he said to Srila Prabhupada, "Swamiji, please do not call them rascals and fools. You do your work, let them do their work. Just leave them alone. Why spend so much time, energy, just pointing out the foolishness, rascalness? If they're fools and rascals, let them be, but don't keep harping that they're rascals and fools." He was very upset that, of course, he still had attachment to these rascals and fools, so naturally he was feeling somewhat personally offended. So Srila Prabhupada stopped. He took his cane, banged it on the road, and all the devotees gathered around to hear what Srila Prabhupada was going to say. And Prabhupada said that if I'm a doctor, a surgeon, and I'm operating on a patient on the operating table, and I'm cutting my patient, performing an operation, and someone walks into the operating room and he starts cutting my patient, am I going to stand there and just watch and say, let him do his work, I'll do mine? No. I will say, "Get out, you rascal!" Of course. I'm not going to stand there. So this is the point, that Srila Prabhupada is seeing the world as his patient. And he's giving the treatment, the medicine that will make the patients healthy and happy and fulfilled. And at the same time, these so-called doctors, fake doctors, are coming in and they're killing the patient. And the doctor isn't going to stand there and tolerate this. So Prabhupada took it as his divine duty, not only to preach the pure transcendental message as it's coming down through the bona fide disciplic succession, but he is also pointing out the defects of those whose understanding is covered by the illusory energy. So this was Srila Prabhupada's spirit in training young men and women in the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, and he was offering these words of Lord Chaitanya to strengthen all the Lord's devotees. The members of Krishna Consciousness movement should be confident that by preaching purely, they would meet with success. I already read that. So, the verses of the 7th canto describe a worldwide inundation of Krishna consciousness. Thus, the objections that Europeans and Americans could not become brahmanas or sannyasis would be swept away as Lord Chaitanya's mercy flooded the entire world. Nothing could check it. The words of Krishnadas Kaviraj intensified Prabhupada's desire to base his worldwide movement on the land where Lord Chaitanya appeared and began his Sankirtan movement. The Panchatattva had begun in Navadvip, and from there the waves of love of God were swelling outward. Quote, in Sridham Mayapur, there is sometimes a great flood after the rainy season. This is an indication that from the birthplace of Lord Chaitanya, the inundation of love of Godhead should spread all over the world, for this will help everyone, including old men, young men, women, and children. The Krishna consciousness movement of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is so powerful that it can inundate the entire world and interest all classes of men in the subject of love of Godhead. In this 7th chapter of the Adi Lila, Prabhupada found many other evidences authorizing ISKCON under the principles of Lord Chaitanya's teachings and activities. Krishnadas Kaviraj says that Lord Chaitanya's taking sannyas was a trick for delivering certain classes of society who would otherwise not have shown him respect. Prabhupada, in his commentary, explained that he also had devised schemes for offering the benefits of Krishna consciousness to as wide a spectrum of society as possible. And he cited his acceptance of women into the Krishna consciousness movement. Quote, therefore, it is a principle, he wrote, that a preacher must strictly follow the rules and regulations laid down by the Shastra, yet at the same time devise a means by which the preaching work to reclaim the fallen may go on with full force. So Srila Prabhupada, as it is mentioned here, devised many schemes for capturing the attention of the world. His scheme, of course, in the Western world was, of course, presenting Krishna consciousness through chanting and dancing, but there's a great deal of emphasis on prasadam, because prasadam is something everyone and anyone can relate to. Eating good food, anyone can relate. So Srila Prabhupada personally cooked for his disciples, and he would want them to continue consuming prasadam until they waddled like a duck. Prabhupada wanted us to become inundated with whatever aspect of Krishna consciousness was appropriate to our state of consciousness. Then also, because Srila Prabhupada felt unsuccessful in establishing Krishna consciousness here widely in India after establishing the League of Devotees in Jhansi, so he went to America and was very successful in making many devotees and establishing temples around the world. But he never forgot India. India was running after the West. And this made it very difficult for him on his own to capture the attention of the Indian population. So it was a brilliant scheme to bring Western devotees to India to show the Indian population that here are Westerners who have achieved all success, who have everything that they want, all of the material goodies that America has to offer, all the wealth, all the opportunities for sense gratification. They've given it up. They've given up something that you are endeavoring for in your everyday activities. So doesn't that make you want to stop and think, what am I doing? Not everybody stopped and thought, but many did. And it was a very effective method that when we were here in the early days in Juhu, in Vrindavan, Delhi, Mayapur, there were just a few devotees, and all the devotees in the very beginning were Westerners, except for maybe one or two who were Indians but had grown up in the West or had gotten educated in the West and joined the movement there. Very few such devotees, Yasomati Nandan, for example. But most of us were Westerners. And there was definitely a noticeable difference in the way that the Indian population reacted and responded to Westerners compared to the Indians. So it was very effective. It surprised me that although India was dominated and controlled by the British, and there was a great deal of resentment, of course, being controlled by a foreign power, and Gandhi's movement, of course we understand from Srila Prabhupada it wasn't really Gandhi who liberated the country. There were many other forces at work that were perhaps even more effective. Subhash Chandra Bose, Prabhupada often referred to him as the real background of establishing liberation or independence for India. But nevertheless, what surprised me was that even though the British were the dominant force here and they were kicked out of India, India had established its independence, but when we came, the Westerners, I felt that there was a great deal of respect from the Indian population. You would have thought that there might be the opposite, because although I'm American, not British, but basically it's the same thing. American, British. British created America, and Americans did basically the same thing that the Indians did by gaining their independence. So, but whether you were an American or you were a Brit, we found that people would respect us, perhaps because we represented a Western style of life which they thought was a more something to strive for. Perhaps it was that, and perhaps they would overlook the history of India and the exploitation of the Western world upon India. But it was very easy for me personally to approach prominent people. I think it helped me to have, lighter skin. That, it opened up doors. So Prabhupada utilized us for his purpose of reaching whatever it took to reach the greatest number of people, to inspire them to take up to one degree or another this process of Krishna consciousness for their own benefit and the benefit of their families and their societies, their countries, and the world. June 27th, 1973. From Mayapur, Srila Prabhupada went to Calcutta. He wrote to Tamal Krishna Goswami, "There is a suggestion by Shamsundar that I may go to London for meeting very important men there in the new house given to us by George. But I want to make some definite settlement of Bombay affairs before I return to Europe or America. If there is a suitable place for me to stay for a few days in Bombay, I can go there immediately, and from there I may go to London." While considering his itinerary, Prabhupada passed some days in the Calcutta temple on Albert Road. He was very free about allowing people to see him, and his room was often filled with local Bengalis as well as his own disciples seated on the white sheet before him. In the evenings he would go, even when it meant riding for miles through congested parts of the city, to spend an hour in someone's home preaching Krishna consciousness. Srila Prabhupada's sister, Bhavatarini, known as Pishima to Prabhupada's disciples, would also visit the Calcutta temple to see her beloved brother and, as usual, to cook for him. One day, however, a few hours after eating her kichoris, Prabhupada felt sharp pains in his stomach. He closed his doors and went to bed. His followers became very concerned. When his servant Shrutikirti came into the room, he found him tossing. "Srila Prabhupada, what's wrong?" "My stomach," Prabhupada replied. "That coconut kichori, it was not cooked." The seizure continued all night, and several devotees continually massaged Prabhupada's body, especially his stomach. But with every breath he would moan. Pishima was standing by, but Prabhupada's disciples feared her presence, thinking she might want to cook something else for him, even in his illness. Prabhupada asked that the picture of Lord Nrsimha be taken from the altar and put beside his bed. Some devotees feared that Prabhupada might be about to pass away. The next morning, when the illness continued, the devotees called for a local Kaviraj, Ayurvedic doctor. The old Kaviraj came and diagnosed Prabhupada's illness as severe blood dysentery. He left medicine, but it was ineffectual. Later, when Prabhupada called Bhavananda to his room and requested fried puris with a little patala, an Indian vegetable similar to a small squash, and salt, Bhavananda protested. Such fried foods would be the worst thing for him. Prabhupada said that this was the blood dysentery cure his mother had given during his childhood. He then called for his sister, and speaking to her in Bengali, told her to prepare puris and patala. Is it patala or patala? Patala. A few hours after taking the food, Prabhupada again called Bhavananda. He was feeling better. "My mother was right," he remarked. A lengthy telegram arrived from Shamsundar glorifying the preaching opportunities that awaited Prabhupada in London, where he would be picked up at the airport in a helicopter and flown to the main event, the greatest Rath Yatra ever held. The parade would proceed down Piccadilly Lane, climaxing under a large pavilion at Trafalgar Square. The telegram went on to say that millions of Englishmen, including certain very, very important people, were eager to see Srila Prabhupada, and that arrangements were underway for Prabhupada to instruct the Queen's eldest son, Prince Charles, in Krishna consciousness. Some of the promises were exaggerated. Srila Prabhupada knew, but his desire to preach again in England was strong. George Harrison had given the devotees a large estate, 45 minutes outside of London, and Prabhupada spoke of going there and installing deities of Radha and Krishna on Janmashtami day. Yet even now, over a month before Janmashtami, he was feeling deeply affected by Shyamasundar's invitation. Although still exhausted from dysentery, he considered flying immediately to London. Calling in those GBC secretaries and sannyasis with him in Calcutta, sitting up in bed, while they sat before him on the floor, Prabhupada asked their advice. They concluded that he should go to a healthier climate, Los Angeles or Hawaii, to rest and recuperate. Prabhupada mildly agreed, as his advisors decided Hawaii would be the best place, a place where the climate was ideal and where he would have few interruptions. Suddenly, however, he sat up straighter. He would return to the West, he said, but to London, not to Hawaii. And not to recuperate, but to preach. Let me strike while the iron is hot, he said. I think that is an English maxim. If you do that, then you can keep the iron in shape. In the West, people are fed up, so we want to give them spiritual enlightenment. Prabhupada had immediately convinced his disciples with his forceful statements. There are two misleading theories in the West, he continued. One is that life comes from matter, and the other is that there is no life after death. You can just enjoy this life. They say everything is matter. So as this Krishna consciousness movement grows, the communists will be curbed down. People say they are trying for unity, but they have no brains to see how this will achieve unity. They have formed a big, complicated League of Nations and now United Nations, but they will all fail. But this simple method of Rath Yatra all over the world, it is spreading. Jagannath means Lord of the universe. So Lord Jagannath is now international God through ISKCON. Therefore, I want to go to the West and give them these things. Although Prabhupada appeared physically unfit to immediately fly to London to the active preaching that awaited him, his disciples submitted, accepting this as another miracle by Krishna. London, July 7th, 1973. Parivida. It was Rath Yatra day. I saw Prabhupada coming to the temple, and he didn't look very strong. I was really amazed, but I could understand that his strength was something spiritual. Dhruvanath. At the parade site, we were waiting to receive Srila Prabhupada at Marble Arch, where the procession starts. The Vyasasan was nicely decorated, and everybody was expecting Prabhupada simply to sit on his Vyasasan on the cart and just ride through the streets, just as he had done in the other Rath Yatras. So it was to our great amazement and joy that when Prabhupada came, he refused to sit on the Vyasasan. He indicated that he would dance and lead the procession. Yogeshwar. They brought stairs up so Prabhupada could mount the Rath cart and sit down on the Vyasasan, but he waved them off and just started walking with the chariots, leading the dancing. Dear Shanta, I twisted my ankle and couldn't walk, so I rode on the cart. Therefore, I could see Prabhupada very clearly. Revati Nandan Maharaj was chanting into the microphone from the cart. But after about 15 minutes of the procession, Prabhupada told the devotees to tell Revati Nandan Maharaj and the others to come down and lead the kirtan on the street with him. Revati Nandan. When Prabhupada saw his Vyasasan on the cart, he said, "No, I am just a devotee. I will go in the procession." We had a big, great kirtan. Hamsadura led, I led, Shamsundar led, different devotees traded off, leading this fantastic kirtan. And Prabhupada was right in the middle of the kirtan with his kartals the whole time. he was dancing back and forth and jumping up and down and dancing. Rohini Nandan. The cart was going quite slowly. Prabhupada walked about 20 or 30 yards ahead of the cart, leading the procession. Meanwhile, the kirtan was coming from the Rath cart through the microphones. Prabhupada called them all down, and he got them all around himself, and they were chanting Hare Krishna. Ever so often, he would turn around to raise both of his arms very majestically in the air and say, Jai Jagannath. Sometimes we would get a little farther ahead, and then he would turn around and wait for the cart to come. Sometimes he was dancing, and sometimes he would stand, raising his hands in the air. Sharadiya Dasi. Prabhupada would dance, and then after a few feet, he would turn around and look up at the deities with his arms raised. Then he would dance for a few moments, meditating on the deities, and then he would turn around and go on. In this way, he danced the entire way. The devotees held hands in a circle around him to protect him from the crowd. It was a wonderful transcendental affair. Prabhupada was looking up at the deities, and all the devotees were behind him. Sudarjaya. Prabhupada surprised us. We didn't know if he was sick or not, feeling weak or dizzy or not. Sometimes he looked very ill. Sometimes he looked like an 18-year-old boy. He surprised us. He had his cane in his hand, but raised it in the air as he danced. After a while, Shyam Sundar came up to me and said, listen, he's not going to make it. Prabhupada is very ill. I want you to follow in a car. But within 30 seconds, reach, so we can be within 30 seconds reach, so we can put Prabhupada in the car immediately. Prabhupada was going down Park Lane, and from time to time he would turn back and raise his hands. He was going so fast that they couldn't pull the cart fast enough to keep up with him. He would have to wait for the cart to catch up. He would turn back, raise his hands and say, Hari Bol. Sometimes he did this, several times he did this. He was going so fast that he had to wait. The devotees were dancing, the weather was beautiful, and the crowd was wonderful. Dhruvanath. The passer-by were rooted to the spot looking at Prabhupada. A man of that age simply dancing and jumping in the air like a young boy was the most amazing sight. And then every 5 minutes or so, Prabhupada would turn around and look toward Jagannath. The devotees would clear the way so that no one blocked his sight, and he had a perfect view of Jagannath, Balaram and Subhadra. But after a while, the police came and motioned that we couldn't keep stopping like this. We had to keep the whole thing going because the traffic jams were becoming critical. Devotees were crying and chanting and dancing, and there was much commotion. Shruti Kirti. When Prabhupada was dancing, the bobbies, English policemen, kept on coming up and looking for someone official. Finally, they came to me and said, "You'll have to tell your leader to sit down. He's causing too much of a disturbance. Everyone is becoming wild and we can't control the crowd, you know." So I said, "All right," but I didn't say anything to Prabhupada. So then they came again and said, "You must tell him. He'll have to sit down." So I said, "All right," and I tapped Prabhupada. The whole time he had been in ecstasy, dancing before the cart and encouraging everyone else to dance. He would motion with his hands and encourage the devotees to keep dancing. He kept the momentum of the festival. So I said, "Prabhupada, the policemen want you to sit down. They say you are creating havoc in the parade." Prabhupada looked at me, turned, and kept on. He completely ignored it and kept on dancing. And they couldn't do anything. Prabhupada wouldn't stop, and the police wouldn't say anything to him. Paravita. I was distributing Back to Godhead magazines along the whole parade route. I was exhausted, and I was having a lot of trouble keeping up with the procession. But Prabhupada was just there, and he was dancing like a young boy. I was amazed at his spiritual energy. Dhruvanath. When we came to Piccadilly Circus, Prabhupada suddenly stopped the whole procession. Piccadilly Circus, of course, was just packed with people. For about 3 minutes, Prabhupada stopped the procession and just danced and danced with the devotees all around him. Rohini Nandan. When we got to Piccadilly Circus, Prabhupada really started to dance. He was leaping off the ground. The cart was stopped. It was very similar, actually, to the description in the Chaitanya Charitamrita of how Lord Chaitanya would lead the Rath Yatra procession. So the cart was stopped, and then Prabhupada would wait for it to catch up. Yogeshwar. When we finally arrived at Trafalgar Square and Prabhupada saw the big tent and the other arrangements the devotees had made, he held up his hands again. He had been dancing and walking the entire route of the parade. It must have been at least an hour that he had been walking and dancing all the way from Hyde Park to Trafalgar Square. Rohini Nandan. When Prabhupada got to Trafalgar Square, he immediately sat down on the plinth of Nelson's column on a little Vyasasan and delivered a lecture about the holy name of Krishna. This was directly after his marathon of chanting and dancing. The next day's papers carried favorable news coverage of the festival, and Prabhupada wrote of it to a disciple in Los Angeles. Quote, "You will be glad to know the Rath Yatra in London was very successful. The Daily Guardian had a picture on the front page of our cart and stated that we were competition to the monument in memory of Lord Nelson in Trafalgar Square. My health is good, and I'm taking daily walk and speaking at the class in the morning." In another letter, Prabhupada wrote, "Our festival here was very well received, and I was so much encouraged by the whole thing that I was able to walk and dance the entire way from Hyde Park to Trafalgar Square." So should we stop? Should I stop or continue? Okay. Srila Prabhupada settled into a regular routine at Bhaktivedanta Manor. Here at Bhaktivedanta Manor, he wrote, "The place is the nicest possible. It is calm and quiet, and the village is neat and clean. Prabhupada's room on the second floor was spacious enough to seat 50 guests comfortably, and its large windows overlooked the expansive grounds. Srila Prabhupada said that if the devotees would clean out the lake and keep up the grounds, then he would stay always at Bhaktivedanta Manor and translate here in peace. They should get some cows, he said, and use some of the extra acreage for farming. Although the devotees had not long been living in the manor and had done little to improve the buildings and grounds, Prabhupada pointed out a place where they could one day build a 30-story temple, the grandest building in all of London. He proposed that he stay for at least 2 months and install Radha Krishna deities on Janmashtami Day. He would also oversee the construction of the temple room and altar. Every morning at about 6, Prabhupada would leave the manor for an hour's walk. There was no restriction as to who could join him, and sometimes as many as 20 devotees would trail behind, trying to hear anything he might say. Looking off toward the horizon, he commented that Lechmore Heath reminded him of Vrindavan. I heard, it may be mentioned here, I don't think so though, that Srila Prabhupada renamed Lechmore Heath to Lakshmimore Heath, the small village where the Bhaktivedanta Manor was. Prabhupada would walk down the lane to a place called Round Bush, stroll past a wheat field, and finally returned to Lechmore Heath and the manor. A local policeman had become friends with the devotees and would regularly exchange greetings with Prabhupada. Particularly, Prabhupada liked the cleanliness of the little village, and he would often point out even the smallest pieces of trash on the manor grounds. The village, he said, was much neater than American towns. Shamsundar had promised Srila Prabhupada many interested visitors, and Srila Prabhupada reciprocated, promising that as long as interested people kept coming, he would remain in England. We can see what it took to keep Srila Prabhupada in one place. Each night, one or two guests, including scholars, priests, and occasional celebrities, would come and visit with Prabhupada for a couple of hours. Prabhupada seemed especially eager to present the philosophy of Krishna consciousness to intelligent persons. As the world's foremost Vaishnava Parampara philosopher of the Gita and the Bhagavatam, he had thoroughly realized the conclusions of the Vedic literature. He was experienced in countering all challenges and atheistic philosophies, and knew what to expect from Christian, Mayavadi, atheist, anyone. If a guest mentioned the name of a philosopher or a school of thought unfamiliar to Prabhupada, then Prabhupada would simply ask, what is his philosophy? Inevitably, he would recognize the new philosophy for what it was, an old, familiar, mundane philosophy with a new twist perhaps, easily defeated or brought to its perfection with Krishna consciousness. Prabhupada was always eager to glorify Krishna and repeat Krishna's message. And with complete enthusiastic freshness, he would present again the same points he had presented many, many times before. He said he was like a cow that gives milk in any field. Put him in India or America or England, he would always give the same nectarian milk of Bhagavad Gita. Prabhupada's entire day, his early morning dictation of Chaitanya Charitamrita, morning walk, Bhagavad Gita lecture, talks with guests, revolved around philosophy. In Scotland, when a man had challenged that God needn't be presented through philosophy, Prabhupada had replied, "What do you expect me to talk, some fairy tales?" Philosophy was necessary, especially for the so-called intelligent persons whose minds raised so many intellectual doubts. And besides, to always be telling others about Krishna, Prabhupada said, was a symptom of love. Moved by compassion for others' suffering, Prabhupada always spoke the message of Krishna and never tired of repeating it. Always spoke the message of Krishna and never tired of repeating it. He was genuinely angered by the atheistic speculators who misled the people because materialistic and impersonalistic philosophies ruined a person's chances of finding the solution to life's suffering. Whenever Prabhupada heard anyone arguing the Mayavad doctrine, he would become like fire. He could not tolerate it. He had to correct it. When, after one of Prabhupada's lectures at the manor, a boy had said he had heard someone call the chanting of Hare Krishna a little bit of a bluff, Prabhupada had replied, "Who says bluff? Who is that fool? Who is that rascal?" He had been ready to fight the atheist to glorify Krishna. These were Prabhupada's natural drives. Therefore, he could go on and on without stopping. He wanted to give people Krishna consciousness. He had no other life. Even while relaxing in the privacy of his room, he always spoke of Krishna consciousness. The devotees had invited many prominent British citizens to meet Srila Prabhupada, and the responses were good. Economist Ernst Schumacher promised to visit, as did philosopher Sir Alfred J. Ayer. When Shyamachandra informed Prabhupada that Mr. Iyer was well known, Prabhupada replied, "What is his philosophy?" "Well," Shyamachandra replied, "he doesn't believe in the existence of God." "I will give him evidence," Prabhupada replied. "I will ask him what he means by the existence of God. I will ask him to make a list of the deficiencies of God's existence." Prabhupada liked to meet with philosophical men and corner them and defeat them. Historian Arnold Toynbee was old and invalid. Therefore, Prabhupada agreed to visit him at his residence. Interested in discussing life after death, Dr. Toynbee asked Prabhupada about karma. Most people, he said, were afraid of death. Prabhupada agreed and added that according to a certain astrologer, one of India's recent leaders had taken birth as a dog. "So they are afraid they will go down," he said. When Toynbee asked if karma could be changed, Prabhupada replied, "Yes, but only by bhakti, devotion to God." Arnold Toynbee, not many people in the West were thinking of this. Prabhupada, they are less intelligent. It is not good. If they take to Krishna consciousness, they can continue to work and live in the city, but they can change their consciousness. Then automatically everything will come. Srila Prabhupada asked Dr. Toynbee about the book he was writing, and the professor replied that it concerned ancient Greece's influence on the Greece of today. The Greeks came from India, Prabhupada said. Vedic culture was once all over the world. Gradually, a new type of culture, just like this recent partition of India and Pakistan, took place. Prabhupada explained how, in the future, the governments would fall to rascals and thieves, whose only business would be to exploit the citizens. Food would be scarce, and the governments would levy so many taxes that the people would be harassed and go to the forest for shelter. Only the God-conscious people would be free. The future would be an ocean of faults, with but one saving factor. Simply by chanting Krishna's names, one could be freed. Even now, Prabhupada said, the hippies were going to the forest, and the men were separated from their wives and money and were going to the hills and forest in disappointment. You can predict the future in this way, Prabhupada said. Arnold Toynbee, in India, did the politicians keep the Vedas? Prabhupada said, no, they threw them away. Present Indian politicians are not very satisfied with the Vedas. They threw them in the water. I have started among the Indians and Americans, and for the next 10,000 years, Krishna consciousness will increase. Then there will be a gloomy picture of Kali Yuga. 10,000 years is not a short time. It is our duty on behalf of Krishna. Arnold Toynbee, do you travel much? Prabhupada, all over the world. A bearded young priest, active in social service, visited Prabhupada and, upon Prabhupada's prodding, debated with him about meat eating and the Bible. During the discussion, Hamsadutta and Pradyumna were citing passages from the Bible against meat eating. Later, after the priest had left, Prabhupada called Hamsadutta back to his room and said, "It was not very good for us to speak on the basis of the Bible. Better we stick to the Gita. Why bother to approach them for compromise or cooperation? They will never be convinced. What is the point of meeting with the Pope? Those inclined to meat eating," Prabhupada said, "can always find some quote in the Bible, such as the covenant with Noah after the flood. We do not even know what ghastly things are occurring in the slaughterhouse," he said. "No one sees these things." The next morning on his walk, Prabhupada continued discussing his talk with the priest. In the name of religion, Prabhupada said, they are killing. The Bhagavatam says, this cheating religion is kicked out and simply worship of God is instated. Devotee, the priest last night said that Jesus ate meat. Prabhupada. Then Jesus contradicted himself. He also said, thou shalt not kill. One shouldn't imitate the Ishvaras. A hippie-type mendicant in India takes ganja and claims to be a devotee of Shiva. No, we should not imitate the powerful controllers. That priest said also that the Bible does not say thou shalt not kill, but thou shalt not murder. So I told him that if the word is actually thou shalt not murder in the original Hebrew, then Jesus must have been preaching to the 4th class, 10th class men murderers. And the proof is that they murdered him. So such people, what can they understand about God? When I told him, the priest was silent. He could not answer. Finished? No. Okay, so I'll just come to the end of this section. Another priest came to see Prabhupada, and again the question came up. Prabhupada asked him, then you are in favor of killing? The priest replied, well, it is a fallen world. It is a fallen world, said Prabhupada, but we do not have to be among the fallen. The priest cited the covenant with Noah. Prabhupada replied, maybe Noah allowed in that time, the time of devastation, but that doesn't mean you always have to do it. You live in such a time one can eat anything to stay alive, but now so many things are in abundance to keep healthy without maintaining a slaughterhouse. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, protect the cows. It is the duty of the Vaishyas. Although Prabhupada willingly discussed with Christians, he admitted privately that to argue with them was a waste of time. They will never agree, he said, even if they are defeated. The best way to preach in general was through the chanting of Hare Krishna, as at the Rath Yatra festival. Chant, dance, and take prasadam, and invite everyone to join. Anyway, he said, they don't even follow their own teachings. One boy came to me and said he wanted to talk. He said, I am a Christian. But I told him, you're not a Christian. Thou shalt not kill. So, stop here. Srila Prabhupada ki. Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita ki. Gauda Premanandi.